morning. It's a pleasure to join you here at the Virtual Math Summit. Today I'm going to talk to you about some of the downstream effects and new directions of the building thinking classroom research. But first, I need to make sure that everybody knows what a thinking classroom is. So a thinking classroom is a set of teaching practices that have emerged out of 15 years of research. It's based on the idea that what are the things we need to do in the classroom as teachers to help our students start to think. Well, if we want our students to think, the first thing we have to do is give them something to think about, and this comes in the form of a task. And in a thinking classroom, we have our students work on tasks both non-curricular and curricular, and the ratio between those two is about 95% to 5%, meaning that 5% of the time we have students working on non-curricular tasks, primarily at the beginning when we're trying to build a culture of thinking. But for the rest of the time, we have students working on straight up curriculum, often directly out of the resources that we have to teach our lessons. A thinking classroom is a place where we get our students to work in random groups of 3 at vertical whiteboards, except it doesn't have to be a whiteboard. It just has to be vertical and erasable. So a window works, a blackboard works, a vinyl picnic table cover stapled to a bulletin board works. My favorite, cheapest hack is cellophane, the stuff that we use to wrap gift baskets with. A sheet of cellophane taped to the wall will work as a vertical erasable surface. Why vertical? Why erasable? It turns out that risk is a barrier to student thinking, and having students work on erasable surfaces really frees them of that risk that prohibits them from thinking. Why vertical? There's a lot of reasons. Having students work on vertical surfaces means that everybody in the group is looking at the work oriented the same way. It allows them to see other students' work, which promotes knowledge mobility. It allows me as a teacher to see everybody's work, which makes me a better teacher. I know where I need to be and I know what I need to do when I get there. I don't have to wait for next week's quiz to find out if the students understand it or not. But all of these are secondary to one of the really primary results of the research into this, which showed that it's not that standing is so good, it's that sitting is so bad. It turns out that when students are sitting, they feel anonymous. And the further they sit from the teacher, the more anonymous they feel. And when students feel anonymous, they disengage. And that's both a conscious and a subconscious act. Having the students stand and work on these vertical erasable surfaces has taken away their anonymity, not in a sort of public outing sort of way. They just don't feel anonymous. They don't feel invisible. They feel seen, and so they don't disengage. A thinking classroom is a place where we don't only have the students working at the whiteboards, we also have them working in their desks. But that a classroom, the way it's structured, is to be defronted, to take away that place, that central place where this teacher can stand and be that sage on the stage. It's a classroom where there is no front, where students are sitting facing every which way, where there isn't a discernible congregation of the things that tend to front a classroom. So the 4 things that front a classroom is where a projector screen is, where a teacher's desk is, which way the students' desks are facing, and where the teacher is standing. And we can see in this picture that the projector screen is on the far wall. It's not pulled down at the time. The teacher's desk is behind the camera. The students' desks are facing every which way. And the teacher uses the whole space for teaching. It's a defronted space. It's a space that's owned by all the learners equally within the classroom. A thinking classroom is a place where we are verbal, much more than we are textual. It's a place where we as teachers try to get that first thinking task into the hands of the students and up on the whiteboards within the first 5 minutes. Postponing that is detrimental to the amount of thinking that the students will give us. Not because there's less time, but because the transition from being a passive receiver of knowledge to being an active creator of knowledge is a difficult transition to make. And the longer we leave the students in that passive role of receiving knowledge, the harder it is for them to transition to becoming a thinker. Getting them up and thinking within that first 5 minutes prevents them from falling into the lull, that malaise of being passive receiver of knowledge. It's a place where we have found that even where the students are when we give the task makes a difference. Having them stand around us as we give the task, whether we're standing around a table or standing around a whiteboard, makes a tremendous difference to the way they engage with the words we are using to describe what the task is. It's a place where we require students to take on leadership roles and be more responsible for themselves. As we work with groups, students have to find ways to help each other and help themselves, to mobilize knowledge, and to access the next question. A thinking classroom is a place where we are constantly and perpetually trying to maintain a balance between the student's ability and the challenge of the task. As they work through curriculum content like factoring quadratics, completing the square, adding 2-digit numbers, multiplying decimals, in a carefully controlled way that maintains that balance between ability and challenge. A thinking classroom is a place where, as we wrap up that time at the whiteboards, the teacher guides the students to bringing order to their thinking through consolidation, primarily through what's called a guided gallery walk, where the teacher uses student-produced work to highlight and signal the important things that have come out of the activity. It's a collection of 14 practices that address each one of the 14 core classroom practice questions that exist. We've known for a very long time that the types of tasks we use makes a difference. We've known for a long time that how we answer questions makes a difference. We know that how we engage in students doing homework makes a difference. What building thinking classrooms is about the pedagogies that actually, and it's about identifying the pedagogies that actually make that difference and help students to think and help us as teachers to get our students to think. So what inspired it? Well, it was inspired by the realization that in a typical lesson, by and large, students are not doing a lot of thinking. And at first, in my journeys through classrooms, this was just a sense. I had a sense that students weren't thinking. And this is a problem, because if students aren't thinking, they're not learning. Thinking is a necessary precursor to learning. And if students are not thinking, they're not learning. And what I was seeing was a lot of not thinking. Deeper research into these sorts of classrooms revealed that my senses were correct. That in fact, in a typical lesson, 80% of students spend no time thinking. 20% do, but the 20% that do are only thinking for 20% of the time. That's not to say that they wouldn't think for longer, but they're often not given more than 20% time to think. So what are they doing? If they're not thinking, what are they doing? Well, some of them are slacking. They're just off task, playing on their phone, talking to their friends, zoned out. Some of them are faking. Some of them are stalling. So stalling and faking are two behaviors that students engage in where they're trying to avoid the work. But unlike slackers who don't seem to care what it is you think about them, stallers and fakers care deeply about what you think of them. So they hide behind a facade. Stallers hide behind a facade of legitimate off-task behavior, like going to the bathroom, sharpening a pencil, getting a drink of water, looking for something in their backpack. These are all off-task behaviors, but they're legitimate off-task behaviors, meaning that they're allowed to occur in the classroom, which is different from illegitimate off-task behaviors like playing on the phone. Faking, where students pretend to be working, is also an off-task behavior. But rather than hide behind a facade of legitimate off-task behavior, they hide behind a facade of on-task behavior. But the biggest problem that I was seeing in these classrooms, the biggest non-thinking behavior I was observing was mimicking. And the realization that mimicking where we show students how to do something and then they just copy it, that mimicking is a huge source of non-thinking behavior. And that the practice of mimicking has emerged out of a set of classroom routines that have existed for a very long time. I do. We do. You do. These routines are so infused into the very fabric of what it means to be a teacher and what it means to be a classroom that they have transcended the idea of classroom norms, have become ensconced in what we call institutional norms. These normative structures of I do, we do, you do exist in classrooms all over the world and have existed in these classrooms for over 170 years. They are what, in many ways, teaching has been defined as. It's what is expected of us. It's how we were taught to teach. It's what our parents, the parents of our children, expect us to be doing. These are institutional normative structures. And I started to realize that everywhere I'm going, I'm seeing students not thinking, and everywhere I'm going, I'm seeing these institutionally normative structures, that these are related. And they're related in such a way that one feeds the other. And this realization came along with the stronger realization that if I wanted students to think, I was going to have to break through these institutionally normative structures. And that became the research. And for 15 years, I worked with over 400 teachers. We worked in 2-week cycles. Our mandate was simple. Break these institutional norms like I do, we do, you do, but not just those norms, other norms as well. The normative structure of the physical space of a classroom, the normative structures around how we do homework and notes and assessment, the normative structure around how we answer questions and the type of tasks we use and how students engage in the moment-to-moment activity within the classroom, where they work, how we give the task. All of these normative structures that have existed with us for over 170 years, our goal was simple. Break these institutionally normative structures and see if it has an impact on student thinking. Can we get more students thinking? Can we get them thinking for longer? And this research was revealing. The first 6 months of this work was crazy fun. For the first 6 months, we were just breaking norms left, right, and center. Anything we could think of, we were breaking and seeing what effect it had on student thinking. And the startling thing about this was that no matter what we tried, no matter what we threw at the wall to see what would stick, everything stuck. Everything stuck. Every time we broke a norm, we increased student thinking. And what that meant was 2 things. Number one, it meant that this conjecture that there's a connection between the institutional normative structure and student thinking was correct. There is a strong connection because when we were breaking those norms, we were increasing student thinking. The second thing it revealed was that we weren't so much teaching students to think as liberating them to think. They already had it in them. We were just removing the barriers, the institutionally normative structures that were holding us back. But after the first 6 months, I realized that we were completely losing control of the data, that I was seeing lots of effect, but we were trying so many things at once that I was losing a sense of causality, that we were seeing impact, but we weren't sure which practices were having which impact on student learning and thinking. And that's when the reorganization of the research happened into these 14 variables. And these were written up, the results of this research was written up in a book. And there was a supplement to that book, which talks about how the 14 thinking classroom practices can be applied in other settings, non-routine settings, things like a resource room, homeschooling, online education, and so on and so forth. And it's also resulted in the work on a subsequent book, which is going to be focused on tasks for a thinking classroom. In fact, 2 books, one focused on K-5 and one focused on 6-12. So what happens in a thinking classroom? We've learned about the practices, we've implemented the practices. So what happens? Well, the first thing that happens is that students think. And they think deeply. This is what a thinking classroom looks like. The people in the middle of the room that look like they may be off task, those are teachers. They're observing the lessons. They're not off task. The students are the ones at the board. And take a look at how much interaction there is. How much interaction within a group, between groups, how much activity and engagement and enthusiasm is occurring here. This is what a thinking classroom looks like. This is a grade 10 classroom. And a few things about this grade 10 classroom that I need to highlight is, number one, that was 75 minutes. For 75 minutes, these students were working at the whiteboards in their random groups of 3. They were thinking the entire time. This school has no bells. So at the 75-minute mark, we had to tell them to leave. The lesson was over. And remember what the baseline data was. In a typical class that I was observing, 20% of students spent 20% of their time thinking and 80% were doing no thinking. In this lesson, 93% of the students were thinking for the entire time. 7%, 2 students, were 50-50, which meant that that our worst thinkers in this lesson eclipsed the best thinkers in a typical lesson that I was observing before we started the research on building thinking classrooms. So what were they thinking about? What task could they possibly have been working on that was engaging them for so long? That sustained that engagement, that energy, that enthusiasm? Well, they were factoring quadratics. And when I say they were factoring quadratics, which in this jurisdiction is a grade 10 topic, when I say that they were factoring quadratics, I mean they factored all of them. That they covered about 2 to 3 weeks worth of content in a short matter of time. And this is something we see over and over and over again in thinking classrooms. Students tearing through content. When students aren't thinking, everything is difficult. When they are thinking, anything is possible. So what happens in a thinking classroom? Well, as mentioned, they work in the random groups of 3 at vertical whiteboards. And they don't just work effectively in those optimal groups, those groups where the teacher steps back and goes, that's going to be a good group. It also functions when the teacher stands back and goes, I'm not sure that group's going to work, and yet it does. And they work even when there is no reason why it should work. When students are so crammed in there that you would think that there'd be so many opportunities for disengagement, and yet they're hyper-focused. And as mentioned, it's a place where leadership emerges and students start to take care of themselves and each other in the learning. Where's the teacher in this photograph? Well, he's the one with the hands up, explaining to students his conjecture. And these are students from 3 different groups, explaining his conjecture about what he thinks is going on in this problem. Where's the actual classroom teacher, the person who's being paid to be the classroom teacher? She's behind the camera, not taking the picture. I took this picture. She's working with a group at a different whiteboard. It's a place where the boundaries, as in the previous picture and in this picture, between groups starts to erode, and they become porous. And as they become porous, knowledge starts to move between the groups as they start to take care of each other, as that sort of knowledge mobility starts to kick in. It's a place where students are so enthusiastic, they run back to their group with the next question, where they find their voice and the courage to want to explain what others are doing to their class. And it's a place where students take pride, where as you try to take a picture of what it is that they're doing, they don't want that picture taken without them having an opportunity to be in it, because they're proud. They're proud of the work they've done. They're proud of the thinking that they've put into this, and they're proud of the results of that thinking. But this was much more than about thinking. My research on building thinking classrooms started in a very clear trajectory. What are the practices we need to do, implement, to first learn about and then implement, that can increase student thinking in the classroom? But as we were doing this, a whole bunch of downstream effects, byproducts started to emerge. Things that were not explicit parts of the research, but started to emerge anyway. Things like empathy. It turns out that students have a tremendous capacity for empathy. We don't give them enough credit for that. And one of the things that emerged in these thinking classrooms time and time and time again was the degree to which students started to care for each other. When we first implement a thinking classroom, one of the first things we see, and we start doing random groups, is one of the first things we see is a marginal improvement in the quality of collaboration. So we implement random groups, random groups of 3, and we see this gradual increase, this marginal increase in the quality of student collaboration. At about the 3-week point, we see a massive jump in this. What happened in that massive jump? What happened was empathy was unlocked. Community is formed. And the way this looks is, we'll be watching a group of students working at a whiteboard, and now they have the answer. They've boxed in the answer, the cap is back on the pen, and then they keep talking to each other. They don't ask for the next question. They're not off task. They're not looking for another question from another group. They're talking about the question that they've just answered. What are they talking about? They're talking about making sure everybody in the group understands exactly what happened in that task. And then when everybody feels like they understand, there's like this exhale. And then a deep breath in, and then they start looking around for the next task. This is what empathy looks like. Real collaboration doesn't begin until students start caring about their partners' learning as much as their own learning. Until that point, all that's happening is patience and tolerance. Real collaboration happens when empathy is unlocked. There's greater enjoyment in a thinking classroom. Students report time and time and time again how they enjoy being in these classrooms, and how time travel goes faster. And it's not just students reporting that they're having a better time, that they're enjoying mathematics. Parents of students are reporting it. Parent-teacher interviews where the parent sits down and says, I don't know what you're doing, but my son loves being in math class with you. And it's not just from the learner side, it's also from the teacher side. Teachers start to enjoy their craft. They start to feel more effective as a teacher. They start to see greater impact at their own hands. And they start to reap the benefits of their efforts in a moment-by-moment way, seeing students learning, thinking, and enjoying the process. One of the interesting things that started to emerge about 2 or 3 years ago, especially in Canada, but also in the US, is that building thinking classrooms all of a sudden started being identified as a high-impact pedagogy for creating equity. In my world, equity is a goal and an outcome. And the actual work, the moment-to-moment work of trying to create equity in my classroom is primarily the focus on trying to create access. And I think this is where building thinking classrooms is achieving this. The idea of having low floor, high ceiling tasks, of thin slicing, of trying to maintain that balance between students' ability and the challenge of the task, of mobilizing knowledge around the room, of creating and sustaining empathy within groups. All of these things create greater access for a broader demographic of learners in the classroom. We see a change in identity as students start to feel like they can be mathematical, that mathematics is something that is part of who they are, and that it's not something that they have to shy away from or be afraid of. It's something that they start to see as achievable, and it shifts their future trajectories, not just where they're going to end up, because that's hard to know, but where they see themselves as potentially ending up. The ability to see themselves in a future that is not limited by their ability or inability to do mathematics. That all of a sudden they can start to think about careers that open up to them, because they're not going to be closed off by their inability to do mathematics. We see greater attendance. That's an interesting byproduct. We start to check. We see a decrease in lates, decrease in absences. Students just enjoy being in the classroom more. And these are all downstream effects that weren't the objective of the research. They just started to emerge as we were building these thinking classrooms. So what's new in a thinking classrooms? This is really what we want to talk about today. What's new in a thinking classroom? Well, there's a whole bunch of different things that are coming out as relatively new. I've already talked a little bit about empathy. Let's talk about self-efficacy. So in mathematics education for a very long time, we've talked of, or not for a very long time, but in recent years, we've talked a lot about growth mindset and fixed mindset. And these, by and large, are binary, right? We have students with a fixed mindset and students with a growth mindset. And it's not attributed to students, it's contextual, but it's binary. Fixed mindset, growth mindset. Long before we talked about mindset, we talked about self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a student's belief in their own ability. And in this particular case, a belief in their own ability to do mathematics. And one of the things we know is that students with low self-efficacy tend to perform poorly, and students with high self-efficacy tend to perform well. And this is research that's been verified and redone and reproduced for decades. There's this old Henry Ford adage, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. And what do we know about students with low self-efficacy? We know that we need to work on their self-efficacy. We need to make deliberate effort to try to increase their self-efficacy. But it's not binary, not like mindset, right? It's not that you have low self-efficacy, high self-efficacy. This is more of a gauge, like the fuel gauge on your car, right? It starts low, and we have to work on moving it towards high. And one of the things that the Building Thinking Classroom research is showing us is that there are a number of different waypoints, significant milestones on this journey from low self-efficacy to high self-efficacy. The first milestone is that the student has to meet a teacher who believes in them. When a student does not believe in themselves, they have to first meet a teacher who believes in them. But what's interesting about this is that there's a huge difference between a teacher who believes in a student and a teacher where the student knows the teacher believes in them. It doesn't matter in the realm of self-efficacy. It doesn't matter how much you believe in a student if the student themselves doesn't know that you believe in them. And how do we show students that we believe in them in a thinking classroom? Well, it turns out one of the primary ways is random groups. Putting students into these visibly random groups of 3, where we let the cards, the popsicle sticks, class dojo, flippity, whatever it is we're using, decide what group students work in. That totally random and totally visible and frequent way of randomizing students actually communicates to students in powerful ways that we believe in them. When we interview students that are 3 weeks into a classroom where visibly random groups are being used, students say things like, "She thinks we're all the same, otherwise she wouldn't use random groups. He believes we can all do it, otherwise he wouldn't use random groups." Students' lived experience in classrooms, especially elementary classrooms, is that they get labeled, and then the labels are used to group them. This is what students tell us. We interviewed 300 students who were all 300 elementary students who were students in classrooms where teachers were using strategic grouping methods. Strategic grouping methods is where we're using the knowledge we have of the students to carefully formulate the groups. So for example, today I want to do differentiation, so I'll make ability groups. Or maybe I want to increase productivity, so I'll make mixed ability groups. Or maybe I just want peace and quiet, so I'll keep certain students apart. This is strategic grouping. Strategic grouping is where we carefully formulate the groups in such a way to meet whatever our goal is, our strategic goal. We interviewed 300 elementary students in these types of settings. And after grade 3, so 8 years and up, 8-year-olds and up, every single one of those students could tell us why they were in the group they were in. Everyone. They all knew what the label the teacher had assigned to that student, and why they were in the group they were in. Random groups takes that away. All of a sudden, students start to believe that you believe in them. Right? They start to see that you believe in them. Another way that this occurs is through the way we answer questions, or more explicitly, we don't answer questions. One of the big practices in a thinking classroom is avoiding answering questions that shut down thinking in the room. And there are two types of questions that do this. There's proximity questions, but more primarily the stop thinking question. Is this right? Are we doing this right? Are we going in the right direction? These types of questions shut down thinking, and we have to avoid answering them. And we tried many different things to try to avoid answering these questions. We would answer a question with a question. Well, what do you think? Right? But it turned out that the best way to respond to a stop thinking question, or a proximity question for that matter, was as they asked the question to just smile at them and nod and go, and when they were done asking the question, to just go, and then walk away. We called it the smile and walk away. And it drove kids crazy to begin with. But 2 to 3 weeks into their experience with this smiling and walking away, if I'm sitting with a group, or I'm standing with a group of students, more accurately, I'm standing with a group of students working at a whiteboard, and I'm immersing myself in with them. And one of the students asked the teacher this question, and she pulls a smile and walk away, and I'm just like, what was that? You just asked her a question. She just smiled and walked away. And the kids are like, yep, she does that a lot. What does that mean? It means she thinks we can figure it out on our own. But what do you think? Yeah, we probably can. She's been right before. This small act, this act of smiling and walking away, is communicating to students that we believe in them. That we believe in them. Now, there's caveats to this. And the caveat is that this smile and walk away only works with students who understand sarcasm and irony. So very young students, K to 2, they don't understand the irony and the sarcasm in that act. So there we're more explicit. We smile, we nod, and instead of just walking away, we say, I know that if you think about this for another 5 minutes, you'll figure out the answer. And we do the same thing with neurodivergent students who are very literal, who cannot pick up on the nuances of sarcasm and irony. But they're communicating the same thing. So let's get back to this idea of self-efficacy. Students with low self-efficacy, on their journey to having high self-efficacy, first have to meet a teacher who believes in them. But they have to know the teacher believes in them. And things like random groups and smiling and walking away tell students we believe in them. The next milestone for these students is they start to believe in the teacher's belief in them. Now, this is different. No belief in themselves. They meet a teacher who they know believes in them. Then they start to believe in that teacher's belief in them. Before they believe in themselves, they believe in the teacher's belief in them. We sometimes call this trust. The students start to trust the teacher. They trust that if the teacher is asking them to do this task, that they'll be able to do it. They themselves don't believe in it, but they trust the teacher. And this turns out to be really, really important in how we select our tasks. That we are using low floor, carefully sequenced tasks. And there's no such thing as having the floor too low. And I'll come back to that in a bit. That students need to meet with success. And as they meet with success, as they start on this journey through a carefully structured sequence of tasks that get progressively harder as their skills improve, they start to trust the teacher. And as they start to trust in the teacher's belief in them, eventually they start to believe in themselves. Now, this idea of self-efficacy leads to two other interesting results. The first one is this: actions are greater than words. This is one of the things that have emerged in the research over and over and over again. Students don't listen to what we say, they listen to what we do. It turns out that the students don't hear us say that I believe in you. They don't hear it. Not the same way as they read our actions. When we do random groups, they hear that. Those actions communicate to students much more profoundly. When we smile and walk away, it has a big impact. Our actions are telling them that we believe in them. But this played out over and over and over again in the research. So one of the big, powerful reasons that we want to defront the classroom is that heavily structured, overly organized, Pinterest-ready classrooms communicate to students in nonverbal ways that perfection is expected. We would show students photographs of these beautifully organized classrooms, and we would ask one question: what do you think this teacher expects? And every time we showed one of these Pinterest-ready classrooms, the student said the same thing: this teacher expects perfection. And that's despite the fact that I would be in some of these classrooms and I would listen to a teacher say, it's okay to make mistakes. I want you to make mistakes. And then I would interview the students and they would say, it is not okay to make mistakes. Why? Because students don't listen to what we say. They listen to what we do. And we may say that it's okay to make mistakes, but if everything about that classroom is screaming that perfection matters, that's what the students hear. When I work with teachers, one of the questions I always ask them is, so what's your view on mimicking? And by and large, teachers will say, not a fan, not a fan. Maybe a little bit at the beginning, fake it till you make it. But overall, I want my students to see connections. I want them to understand. I'm not a fan. Then I interview their students. And there's been situations where 100% of their students will say, our teacher wants us to mimic. A teacher who says they do not like mimicking, their students will say, our teacher wants us to mimic. Why? Because students don't listen to what we say. They listen to what we do. And if what we do is I do, we do, you do, what the students hear is that we want them to mimic. And this just played out over and over and over again in the research. Students don't listen to what we say. They listen to what we do. Actions are greater than words. So when you're teaching, whether you're teaching in a thinking classroom or not, ask yourself, not what you are saying, not what you're verbally saying, but ask yourself, what are your actions saying? What are they saying to students? The other thing that this conversation around self-efficacy has revealed for us is something about perseverance. And this is new. So in chapter 9 of my book, I talk a lot about perseverance as being the boundary between flow and frustration. It's that space where students, the degree to which a student or a group of students are willing to work on something where the challenge exceeds their ability. That is the definition of perseverance. But where does it come from? How is it formed? This is something that is new to us. In the original research, we could see when it was there, but now I'm much more interested in where it comes from. So our research is showing that perseverance is much more a state than it is a trait. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is, okay, you have students who are more persistent than other students. Right? This is part of the diversity of our classrooms. Some students are more likely to persevere than others. They have greater perseverance traits. But even the most persistent student will give up under the wrong circumstances. And even the most vulnerable student will persevere under the right circumstances. So what are those right circumstances? What we have found is that when students meet challenge, and we want them to meet challenge, we want them to struggle. We want them to have productive struggle. Now, we've talked about productive struggle in math education for a few years. But what do we mean by that? Because there's actually two types of struggle. There is that sort of, oh, this is stupid, I give up, I hate this struggle. And then there is the more optimistic struggle, which is, I can get it, I'm going to keep going. And that's what we mean by productive struggle. We want the more optimistic struggle rather than the pessimistic struggle. But how do we get that? Well, it turns out that when students meet challenge, which is what we want, when they meet challenge, if they meet challenge on the heels of success, they are more likely to rise to the occasion than to give up. When students meet challenge on the heels of failure or no success, so they meet challenge immediately, they are more likely to give up. And this is true whether students are persistent as a trait or not. Perseverance is a state more so than it is a trait. And this comes back to this idea of trust in self-efficacy. If we construct environments where the students will meet with success, they will also meet with challenge, but they will meet with challenge on the heels of success, we are also building perseverance. And this also links back to some of the things on thin slicing and flow from chapter 9, which is when I said earlier, there is no such thing as having the floor too low. When you are constructing those tasks, with that sequence of tasks, make sure that that first encounter that students have is going to be met with success. Because success begets success. As they have success on that first task, and then they have success on that second task, and then they have success on the third task. When they meet that fourth task, the one that is really going to challenge them, the fact that they've had success is going to make them believe in themselves that they can have success again, and they're going to rise to the challenge much more so than run from the event. And this also explains why, by and large, in my research, there was a category of tasks that started to reveal themselves as ineffective at building a culture of thinking. Math contest tasks. They proved to be relatively ineffective. Why? Because students meet challenge immediately. The task is hard right from the beginning. And there is a category of students who thrive in that environment. And ironically, in many cases, that category of student is a category that grows up to become math teachers. And this is something that revealed itself over and over as well, that we are not representative of our students. We cannot be proxies for our experiences, should not guide what is most effective for students, because we are a unique subset of education. We are the students who loved order, who thrived in the routines. And now that's revealing itself to be ineffective for many, 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 many students. What else? So let's talk about mild, medium, and spicy. So one of the things that is new in our research is in my work, in the book, I talked a little bit about how to come up with the labels for the different levels of complexity when we're doing check your understanding questions, when we're doing self-assessment, when we're doing standards-based assessment. And one of the things our research revealed was that you can use a lot of different levels for the depth of complexity or the level of mastery that's required to get through a task, as long as the labels you use label the mathematics, not the learner. And this comes back to the growth mindset research, right? Because the growth mindset research revealed to us that students with a fixed mindset tend to see feedback as a description of who they are rather than where they are. So when we use labels that are descriptive of students, like novice, master, emergent, things like that, it has a predisposition to harming students by putting them into a mindset of descriptions of who they are rather than where they are. Well, one of the things that's really revealed itself since the book has been published is that if we use the headings of mild, medium, and spicy, it radically changes the way students engage with things. And this is what I love about the research, that sometimes it's big things like getting them up on vertical whiteboards, and sometimes it's little things like changing the way we label things, right? So let's say we have our students working on tasks at the whiteboards in their groups, and now we sit them down and say, okay, we're going to give you some check your understanding questions, which is what Building Thinking Classrooms calls homework. we're going to give you some check your understanding questions. And then I write them up on the board in 3 columns. And I label those 3 columns mild, medium, spicy. It radically changes the way the students engage with these tasks. So I'm in one classroom and this girl puts up her hand. Grade 4 classroom, she puts up her hand and says, can I have another spicy one? I'm like, sure. So I write up another spicy one on the board. Another boy puts up his hand. Can we have one more spicy? I'm like, okay, but this is the last one. And then 15 kids in the room, 15 grade 4s are like, the 12 teachers who are observing these students, some of who teach these students are like, who are these kids? We can't get them to do anything. And now they're asking for more spicy questions. I'm in a grade 8 classroom. Same thing, Pythagoras, mild, medium, spicy. And we're listening to kids. And this one student says, you know what? I'm doing mild questions today. And his partner goes, what are you talking about? We were doing spicy on the board. It's like, okay. Another 2 students who had struggled up at the whiteboard are talking to each other. And one says to the other, okay, there's only 10 minutes left. Here's the game plan. We do 1 mild, 1 medium, and then we go straight to spicy. Small things like how we label the tasks that we want students to engage in makes a difference. I don't know fully why that makes a difference other than who doesn't want to be spicy. Let's talk about one more of these, and we'll talk about triggering. So thinking classrooms, and I want to be honest here, building thinking classrooms is a pedagogy. And it radically transforms the way students engage with mathematics, but it doesn't at its core necessarily or immediately change their perception of what mathematics can be outside of this environment. So I'll give you an example of this. I was working in a classroom for 3 months. 3 months we had a thinking classroom. It was brilliant, right? And every single day, we were using tasks right out of the textbook. We didn't tell them that. We were writing them up on the board, putting them on slips of paper, telling them verbally. They didn't know the tasks were coming from the textbook. And for 3 months, this classroom was amazing. And then at the 3-month mark, we came in and we said, okay, here's your random groups. First task today, question 3 on page 47 of your textbook. All of a sudden, someone in every group had their hand up. And we're like, what's going on? And they're like, yeah. We're like, we hadn't seen a hand up in 2 months. And they're like, yeah, you didn't show us how to do this. For 3 months, we had been using questions right out of the textbook. And now when we signal to them that it was coming out of the textbook, all of a sudden, you haven't shown us how to do this. Why? Because the textbook is a trigger. And it triggers a certain student behavior. And that behavior is mimicking. Because textbook questions are perceived by students to be questions that they are asked to do after they've been shown how to do it. Textbook questions are mimicking questions. They don't bring that same level of assumption to when we just say it to them verbally. There are lots of things that trigger students back into behaviors that are less conducive to thinking, and we have to be on guard for that. All right. So how do we build a thinking classroom? Well, as highlighted before, it's a collection of 14 practices. And there's a sequence to it. It's not just 14 practices. There's also a framework around how to implement it. It's not just about the research, it's also about the implementation. And we spent 2 years trying to understand where to start. Because once you have the knowledge of these 14 practices, where do we start? I can tell you this, if you go into class tomorrow and the only thing you do is don't answer questions, you're going to have a bad day. It's not the place to start. So after 2 years of research, this framework emerged. And what it tells us is the sequence in which we should be implementing these things in our classroom. And it starts at the top in what we call the first toolkit. The first toolkit, thinking tasks, random groups, vertical surfaces. And the research clearly tells us that we should do all 3 of those at once. Why? Because it turns out to have almost nothing to do with the teacher. Yeah, the teacher has to enact it, but why? Because what this does is it radically transforms the environment. It breaks through the norms in such a way that students can be different. After this, we go to the next toolkit. Here, there's 5 practices. How we give the task, when we give the task, where we give the task, defining the classroom, how we answer questions, how we use check your understanding questions, and how we start to build independence and responsibility within the lesson. Here, you do the practices one at a time, and the order doesn't matter. Then we move to the next toolkit. Here, one at a time, but the order does matter. And then all the assessment is in the last toolkit. And this is called the Building Thinking Classroom Framework. And it actually taught us a whole bunch of additional things. One of which is that small change is no change. We kept seeing this in the research over and over and over again. We thought, okay, we're just going to, at least initially, when we're initially trying to build a thinking classroom, there isn't a way to ease into it. Because we tried. We would try to ease into some things. And it wasn't having the impact. Why? Because the normative practices, the normative structure of classrooms is an incredibly stabilizing force. It creates a system. And the thing that systems are known for is that they defend themselves. When the system is attacked, it defends itself. So when you make a small change to a system, the system defends itself. That first toolkit, thinking tasks, random groups, vertical surfaces, are not small changes. They are big changes, and they overwhelm the system so that the system can't defend itself, at least not as effectively. And it allows students to start to form different habits. Assessment should reflect practice. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this in the research. Should assessment set the tone for practice, or should assessment reflect the practice? Well, our research is sort of falling on the side that it should reflect practice. This framework of 4 toolkits emerged empirically from research, and it put all the assessment practices in the last toolkit. And I think that's not by accident. I think assessment should reflect practice. And until we get to there, our practice is still changing. And building student collective and individual responsibility takes time. There are 3 main practices in this framework that are what we call responsibility practices, where students start to take on more ownership of their learning. The first one is how we use check your understanding questions instead of homework. Instead of homework as an accountability practice, it is now a responsibility practice. They choose if they want to do it. They choose which ones they want to do. Same with meaningful notes. Rather than making them write the notes, which is an accountability practice, they choose what to write and how much to write. And formative assessment. Formative assessment, that's about informing learning. Assessment classically has been about accountability. In this framework, in this pedagogy, formative assessment is about informing learning. And it's a responsibility practice. And I don't think it's happenstance that these 3 responsibility practices have ended up being spread out through this framework, because responsibility takes time for students to acquire. They can't be flooded with too much of it at once. And I think it naturally spreads it out throughout the framework. And the last one I'll talk about is that teachers' abilities grow over time. So you implement a thinking classroom, and just when you got everything going exactly the way you want, they change the kids on you. And now you got to start over. Except, do you? Do you really have to start over? It turns out you don't. Because although you're going to get new students who are not familiar with thinking classrooms, you are. So whereas thinking classroom is developmental for you and for students, in the second year, you've already acquired a comprehensive understanding of what this looks like. Your students have not. So it's developmental for them. And that's why there's still a sequence for it. But you, as a teacher, your competencies have grown, and these toolkits look different in the second year. So thank you for your attention. If you want more information, #ThinkingClassroom is a really good place to go on Twitter. Building Thinking Classroom Facebook groups. There's 18 Facebook groups now. There's highly focused ones, K-2 one. There's ones linked to particular curriculum. The main group has 34,000 people in it. There is a French one. There's a Danish one, if that floats your boat. And if none of these actually fit what it is you're looking for, apparently you can just make your own, because I didn't make any of these. These are teacher-driven initiatives, and they're incredibly supportive of teachers who are trying to make changes in their classroom. There's a website, and if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, the bit.ly will get you there, as will the QR code. Other than that, thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a good rest of the summit.